Hello EU4 players, my name's Riemann, and this video will be the first of a mini-series where I discuss several military topics that are frequently requested. Today, I'll be going over the basics of the combat system, taking a look at how base damage is calculated, how combat width and battle lines function, and from these, extrapolating what an ideal army composition would look like. I'll break the system down to its parts to give you a clear look at how it functions. I'll use plenty of examples and hold as many extraneous variables constant to give you the greatest insight into what's going on when your units engage the enemy. Then, I'll wrap it up with a look at some rules of thumb you should follow when designing your forces, as well as some variations you can make to your army composition depending on your circumstances. Here's an example of a normal battle you might see. Battles are composed of 3-day phases that alternate between fire and shock, with the fire phase coming first. The fire phase represents ranged attacks like longbows, muskets, rifles, and cannons, while the shock phase represents hand-to-hand combat with swords, pikes, sabers, and bayonets. This phase cycle forms the backbone of much of the army modifiers that I'll discuss in next week's video. For right now, all you need to know is that the battle will continue with these phases until one side's morale depletes entirely, at which point it retreats. The Casualties Equation is quite involved and has an enormous amount of modifiers that go into it. For this video, I'm going to explain these portions, which are essentially the base casualties. To do that, I made a mod that holds everything I possibly could constant. Things like tactics, fire and shock modifiers, combat ability, discipline, dice rolls, and others are all held at fixed values, so neither side has an advantage. Furthermore, I'm going to start with one regiment fighting one other regiment to keep things simple. With that, the Casualties Equation simplifies to just two terms, a constant of 15 multiplied by the strength of the regiment. If I pause, you can see in the first day of battle, both sides kill 15 enemy troops. This is just a base value built into the system. Then, on subsequent days, the amount of troops killed decreases proportional with how many soldiers the regiment has to fight with. So for example, if a regiment only had half its men left, it would do half its normal damage. Dead soldiers can't fire their guns. Now I throw dice rolls into the mix. At the beginning of each phase, both sides roll a random number between 0 and 9, which gets multiplied by 5 and added to the casualties. For example, blue rolls a 7 and thus kills 50 enemy soldiers. Then, when 3 days pass, the phase changes and so the dice are rolled again. This time, white rolls 8, so they kill a base of 55 blue soldiers, that's reduced a bit by casualties taken, while blue rolls 2, so they kill a base of 25 enemies, that, again, is reduced a bit since blue has already taken casualties and so its unit isn't at full strength. You can see the dice roll has a huge impact on battles, but it's completely random, so there's not a lot of strategy involved. Next, I return the dice to always rolling zeros and I turn attention to leader pips. Generals have a skill value for fire and shock phases indicated right here that helps their side in battle. Whichever side's general has more pips gets a bonus to rolls equal to their pips minus the enemy general's pips. So for example, here I have a general with 1 pip in both fire and shock, and I attack the enemy with no general, which effectively has 0 pips in fire and shock, so I get a +1 in each phase. Then, if I give the enemy a general with 2 pips in each, they would get a +1 in each phase because their pips are 1 higher than mine. Then, if I had a general with 1 fire pip but no shock pips, while the enemy had a general with no fire pips and 1 shock pip, the bonuses would alternate between the phases. Next, we have terrain bonuses. The attacking side gets a penalty to rolls when combat takes place in defensible terrain. The penalty is -1 for most terrain types like woods, hills, and marshes, and it's -2 for mountains. This once again shows up in the battle window, and does what you'd expect, reducing the base value by 5 or 10. Note that armies sieging forts are considered attackers no matter what, which makes forts in harsh terrain extremely valuable. Finally, we have unit pips. These behave similarly to general pips in that there are fire and shock pips which alter rolls in their according phase. The way it's calculated is both sides take their offensive pips for that phase, subtract the enemy's defensive pips for that phase, and the result is added to the combat rolls for each side. For example, I change my unit type to ones that have 1 offensive pip in both fire and shock, and you can see I do 20 damage at the start, which is akin to having a +1 to rolls. Unit pips don't show up on the dice roll portion of the combat panel because they are a per unit modifier, even though they act like a basic dice modifier. You can see that if I change white to have units with offensive pips too, they start doing more damage as well. That's all for base casualties. I held things constant so you could see how each of them functioned, but in the game, they'll all get thrown at you simultaneously. While the combat equation still has some further complexity with its many modifiers that I'll discuss in the next video, understanding the base damage should give you enough of an idea of what's going on that we can take a look at the next topic, which is flanking. Regiments aren't going to fight each other individually. Nations group many of them together to make armies, and use those to fight enemies. When the number of regiments is low and equal between the two sides, things are simple. If there were 5 regiments on each side, there would be 5 times as much damage. Pretty simple, but fights are rarely equal like this. If we give one side 7 regiments, their base damage will be 105 casualties inflicted, and you can see the infantry on the flanks have a bent arrow, indicating they are flanking. But then, if we pile even more regiments on one side, like making it a 5 versus 20, something weird happens. Despite having way more troops, the larger side still does a base damage of 105 casualties inflicted. This shows the phenomenon of flanking range, which represents how many regiments to its side that a unit can attack in combat. Infantry start with a flanking range of just 1, meaning they can attack an enemy regiment one place to the side of them, but get any further beyond that and the infantry just sits there, which is why a 7k army and a 20k army deal the same base damage to 5 regiments of enemies. And here is where cavalry come in to save the day. For the vast majority of nations, cavalry does more damage than infantry, but the difference isn't enough to fully justify it being 2.5 times more expensive. The reason why it's still worth building cavalry though is for its flanking range. Cav starts with 2 flanking range, meaning it can dish out damage to units 2 slots to its side. Putting so much damage into a few enemy troops means you can roll through the enemy's sides quite quickly, which will lead to their entire force falling apart faster. Because you typically only want to take battles where you have numerical superiority, you can get a lot of mileage out of a few horses like this. So if cavalry's main benefit is flanking, how many of them should you include in an early game army? Well, if infantry has a flanking range of 1 and cavalry has a flanking range of 2, you might think that you'd want to include 2 cavalry so you can maximize the use of your infantry, then have a cavalry on each side to squeeze in a couple more units that can deal damage. It's reasonable to think this, and the wiki even backs it up. But it's also wrong. Unless you want to do an insane amount of micromanagement, you'll be at the mercy of automatic army deployment, which doesn't allocate troops optimally. If you go in with 2 cavalry, the game will place them on the interior of their flanking range first, so you'd be left with infantry floating around uselessly on the sides. Hence, the optimal army composition in the early game for most nations is a lot of infantry and 4 cavalry. This might change a bit if you're playing a nation with a lot of cavalry bonuses, like a horde or an eastern nation, in which case you'd want to make more extensive use of mounted soldiers early on. But that's another video. Now, so far I've covered early game army composition, when wars typically only involve 1 or 2 armies with little artillery. But warfare changes dramatically as the years tick on. Around Tech 16, you'll want to switch over to late game strategies and unit compositions, as wars will increasingly be characterized by many armies piling on and massive battles involving hundreds of thousands of troops. First, I need to talk about artillery, which has 2 critical features that entirely define how you want to use it, and even how you should structure your armies. First, artillery is the only unit type that can attack from the second row. Back there, it does half of its advertised damage, and even with only 50% of its power, it still has a huge impact on battles by dramatically increasing the amount of kills you can dish out. The second critical feature of artillery is that it takes double damage. But an important fact about the combat system is that units take no damage while in the second line. Artillery will only be in the second line as long as they have a unit of infantry or cavalry to hide behind. Essentially, you want your second line to be filled with only artillery, since it's the only type of unit that actually does something while it's back there, and you never want to have your artillery be in the front line because it just melts when it's exposed like that. So how does this translate into what your late game unit composition should be? Well, to talk about that, we first need to talk about combat width, which is how many regiments wide the first line and second line are in battle. It increases with technology and is the backbone you want to organize your army around. During a battle, you obviously want to maximize the amount of damage you deal to your opponent, and to do that, you want to ensure you have enough artillery to completely fill the second line. So if the combat width was 30, you would want 30 artillery in each army that you engage the enemy with. This is, by far, one of the most common beginner mistakes I see. Chances are, if you're new to EU4, you aren't building enough artillery. Okay, so we have our backline, but what about the front line? First off, cut out cavalry entirely. I see tons of guides and forum posts saying that you should still include them later in the game, but you really shouldn't. The most obvious reason is that flanking becomes a non-issue when both armies completely fill the combat width, which nullifies their most important use. But there's like an additional half-dozen smaller reasons why Cav's usefulness falls off a cliff, which are beyond the scope of this video. Suffice it to say, unless you're playing Poland and heavily speccing for combat ability, cavalry don't belong in your army once you transition to the late game. With that being the case, you should fill your front line with infantry. But how many infantry you should use is debatable and depends on your situation. There are three main schools of thought. At the very least, you'll want to have as many infantry as you have artillery so your cannons have something to hide behind. If the combat width was 30, you'd have 30 artillery and thus 30 infantry. This has the aesthetic benefit of being entirely symmetrical, and is great if combat is a secondary concern. It might seem weird to design an army this way, but oftentimes it's the most efficient way to use your resources. If you have massive superiority, then there's no reason to include extra infantry, which would just create attrition and siphon maintenance costs. This is especially true if you're exploiting the fact that the current AI is a massive coward that will completely abandon its home provinces if you bring anything even close to resembling a larger military force. In the late game, you can win wars against massive opponents without even fighting a single battle. However, this composition loses when it's pressed into frequent combat. When the infantry dies, your cannons in the back will be exposed to massive losses. This happens not just in the thick of battle, but also with reinforcement. If your armies win the first battle, they'll be vulnerable to the second, as the infantry will be horribly depleted. This can be allayed somewhat by marking heavily and just recruiting a bunch of reinforcements, but you're still more vulnerable than you could be. During combat, if your infantry wavers, you'll need to reinforce with another army, which is bad since you'll be overstacking artillery. At best, this is inefficient in terms of money, as you'll be paying more upkeep for artillery that's not doing much. And at worst, you'll light your manpower on fire if you lose the battle, because the extra artillery will all take turns getting massacred in the front line. The second school of thought is to use equal combat with armies of infantry and artillery as before, but to back them up with some armies consisting of pure infantry. This fixes the previous strategy's problem of overstacking artillery, as you won't reinforce an army with a main battle stack. You'll reinforce it with just what it needs: cheap cannon fodder that can hold the line. This is definitely the most efficient way of increasing your staying power in late game fights. This is great when big showpiece battles are the central focus, i.e. multiplayer. However, it comes with its own downsides. First, it's worse at sieging since the pure infantry armies get no bonuses against forts. Sieging is a huge part of this game, so that shouldn't be discounted lightly. Second, the pure infantry stacks become glaring weak spots. You'll keep them behind your main battle armies obviously, but if the enemy manages to wiggle around your forces while you aren't looking, the lack of artillery support will mean your infantry will do very little damage to the enemy, forcing you to make a very disadvantageous trade with them. Even if you do rush proper armies into the fray, they'll still be reduced in effectiveness by a bunch of infantry clogging up the backline. The final school of thought is a compromise between the two. Instead of having dedicated infantry-only armies, you would just include some extra infantry on your main battle stacks. The exact amount extra varies significantly from person to person, being between just a few extra on the low end to as much as 50% more at the high end. This strategy combines some of the strengths and weaknesses of the previous two. If you need to quickly get into fighting shape, you can consolidate some of the extra infantry into full battle-ready regiments. All your armies can siege well, and you have no glaring weak spots. But you'll take more attrition in some places, and the extra infantry hanging around will mean it will probably never be as efficient as it could be. But overall, it's still reasonably effective in a wide array of situations. Finally, no matter which of the three strategies you pick, you'll want to take your main armies and split them in half. The supply limit isn't high enough to go around with full armies, necessitating them being divided in two, or else you'll face horrible attrition. Then, when you're planning to attack, you'll either want to merge your armies back together, or make sure they arrive at the province on the same day. Combat deployments with regards to reinforcements is very weird, and if you throw your armies in piecemeal, you can often find random infantry stragglers hanging out in the backline even though you have undeployed cannons waiting to get into the action to actually do something. It's not a huge deal if you can't manage this, but you have no reason to voluntarily give up some combat potential when you could otherwise bring your full force into the fray. Managing military matters is a critical skill in this game, and so a proper understanding of army composition is the bedrock of a solid campaign. There's still a lot more to cover in terms of warfare in EU4, and so I hope you'll continue with me in the next episode of the War Academy. My name's Riemann, and until next time, thanks for watching.